It's a good crowd already.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Nonprofit Leadership Center 2025 webinar series. Today we have Stephen Shattuck with Capital Campaign Pro, and he will be presenting the State of Capital Campaigns 2024 and 2025 research findings. I'm just gonna go over the rules of the road real quick. To minimize background noise and distractions, I have muted all the lines for the duration of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website in the next few days. We will also be sharing the slide deck on our website, and you will receive it on your email as well. I have enabled a closed captioning on, so if you wish to turn it off, you can easily disable it using the Zoom settings. We warmly welcome your questions. You can type them in the chat box. Stephen will leave aside about 5-10 minutes at the end of class to answer those. Or you can, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, a very really pressing question, and you want some clarification. If you haven't already, you can start sharing your name and your organization in the chat box. But we are so delighted to have Stephen with us today, and we're looking forward to a great and informative webinar. So on to you, Stephen.
All right, thanks so much, and thanks everybody at NLC for having me, and thanks to all of you for hanging out on a Wednesday afternoon. I hope you're having a good day. And if you're watching this as a recording, feel free to drop me a line, maybe on LinkedIn, and let me know that you watched it. I hope you're doing okay from sometime in the future. But yeah, we're here to talk about capital campaigns. So a little bit about me. Like Isabella said, I work at Capital Campaign Pro. We're a capital campaign consultancy. If you're interested in that, you can check us out. We're pretty easy to find online. But I have been doing research for the better part of 2 decades in the nonprofit sector, and that's kind of what I'm bringing to our firm over the last 3 years since I've been there. Been very involved with AFP, the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, and I just love doing nerdy research. So that's what we're going to be talking about here over the next hour or so. So if you're here for capital campaigns, you are in the right place. And just a little bit about our agency. Like I said, if you're maybe gearing up for a campaign and think you might need a little bit of help, check us out, because that's what we do when we're not talking about our benchmark study. So just to set the stage here, say hi in the chat if you haven't already. I'd love to know who you are and where you're from. But also, if you don't mind just chatting in, kind of where are you at in the capital campaign spectrum? Are you thinking about a campaign? Are you in the middle of one right now? Or just finishing one up? Let me know, because that'll kind of help me tailor a little bit of what I'm talking about. Usually when I give this presentation, it's a pretty even split kind of amongst those 3 cohorts. And the reason I split it up that way is that's how the research was split up. So no matter where you are on that spectrum, you are going to be able to take away a few nuggets here. So some people are saying just finishing up, just starting. Trevor, always in a capital campaign. I love that, Trevor. You're my hero. I love that. So, no matter where you are, there's going to be some stuff in here for you. So let's talk about the study. This is a study I've been doing for about the last 3 years or so. When I joined Capital Campaign Pro in late 2022, one of the first questions I asked the co-founders is, well, I know I'm not too well versed in capital campaigns, candidly. Where should I go to kind of find out what people are typically faced with? What's the average campaign length and the average campaign amount and those things? And they kind of said, there isn't actually a benchmark study. So I said, well, let's make one. So that was kind of what we decided to do back in 2022. There really isn't any formal sort of scientific research into capital campaigns prior to this study. What there are a lot of is case studies and anecdotes and stories that people tell about their campaigns, and all that is great. But we were sort of missing that third leg of the stool of kind of hard empirical data. So that's what this study is hoping to provide to the sector. And when we were first talking about this study, it was obviously a very tough time for fundraising. It seems like we're kind of back in a tough period right now, of course. But we wanted to know, how did the pandemic impact campaigns, if at all? How did this the sort of the fear of the looming recession and inflation impact campaigns? And I thought that I could put those topics to rest, but it seems like those are going to come back in next year's study. But we're going to be covering those for sure. And then the kind of the last reason that we wanted to do this study is capital campaigns are scary. It's a big deal. It can be a game changer for any organization. They're big undertakings, and we wanted to maybe allay some of the common fears that we hear in our consulting, with not just our stories and anecdotes, but also again some hard empirical data. So that's kind of the reason we've been putting this report together. So for this most recent study, I first sent out the survey back. It was maybe a little under a year ago, around this time of year. It was probably more like May or June. Collected all the survey results, compiled all the data, and then last October we released this report. So it's maybe 6 or 7 months old at this point. It is the most recent data we have. And if you're here listening, I would love for you to fill out next year's survey, which is probably going to come out here in the next couple of months. So I know I may send that to Isabella, and then I'll see if they will be willing to signal boost it. But if you download this research report, you'll at least get that request to fill out the study. But this most recent data set that we're going to go through today, over 500 nonprofits and 500 unique campaigns were analyzed. Only about 10 to 15 of those campaigns were our clients. So, when a lot of companies do these studies, sometimes it's just like it's their clients. That's not what this is. This is meant to be a very sort of wide swath of the nonprofit sector, at least in North America. So analyzed all the data, deduped things and made sure though all those 500 or so organizations were legit and unique campaigns, verified all the identities of the respondents, and then posted the results back in October. And like I said, it is split up between 3 cohorts, which is why I asked about you guys: pre-campaign, mid-campaign, and post-campaign. So what I'm going to do is kind of go over what I thought were the most interesting and kind of germane findings. We don't have time to go through, word for word of the report. Definitely download it because there's a lot of good nuggets that I'm just not going to have time to get into. But I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to some of the supporters, the partners we had on this study. The AFP Foundation, they were awesome partners, as well as Bloomerang, iWave. They're called Kindsight now. They were called iWave back when we did the report. And then Aspen Leadership Group. They were great in helping us get the word out, formulate questions, come up with new questions, look at the data, analyze it. So thanks to those guys as well. So definitely download the full report. It's free. If you download it, a salesperson's not going to email you, I promise. That won't happen. That's not why we do it. It's just capitalcampaignpro.com/research. Just /research will get you there. It'll redirect to 2024. You could look at 2023 if you wanted, but it was a smaller data set. And then one last preamble before I get into it. If any of you listening are a YMCA, we also partnered with NATO on a YMCA specific version of the report. We had almost 100 YMCAs kind of naturally take the survey. So I reached out to NATO and I said, hey, do you want to do something special with just those answers? And the reason I shout this out is, one, if you're a YMCA, you should definitely download that addendum because there's some interesting tidbits there. But as I do this study in the future, I'd like to have more specific kind of versions, maybe an animal welfare one, a social service one, housing, whatever kind of makes sense that the data comes in. So I say that since this is an invitation. If you're listening and you're like, hey, how did all the food banks differ? Send me a message because I would love to look into the data and slice and dice it for you. I will accept that challenge for sure. So let's get into kind of the top level findings. So the first thing that kind of jumped out at us is that most people who took the study said that they were happy with their campaign. We asked people, were they satisfied with the results of the campaign, regardless of how much money was raised. 96% of people said yes. So I say this because it seems like, for the most part, if people kind of see it all the way through, they tend to come out of that 2, 3, 4 year process happy, even if they only raised 70, 80% of their funds. So again, this is meant to kind of give you people confidence, you people that are just kind of in the early stages, that You know, and then just 2 years on, you know, people don't seem to come out, you know, crashing and burning or feeling kind of bad about it. Small shops. So I am arbitrarily defining small shops here as folks who raise 1 million or less in their annual fundraising kind of off campaign years. So that was a cohort that I sort of isolated amongst the 500 respondents, looked at how those folks did, and they are just as successful, if not more successful, in a number of categories. So I've got a special kind of small shop slide coming up here. So if that is you, or maybe if you're kind of around that number, again, totally arbitrary, not meant to be pejorative in that definition at all. But you can do it too. Now, there's a couple of caveats we'll talk about, but you know, the capital campaigns are not just for the big organizations, is kind of my takeaway there. The annual fund. The annual fund was something that we analyzed a couple different ways. When I proposed this research study to our co-founders, the number one question they said back to me is, Stephen, you got to ask about the impact on the annual fund. This is the number one question we get when we talk to people who are kind of early stages considering a campaign. What is going to happen to the annual fund? You know, very often they're concerned, you know, is it going to cannibalize the annual fund? Are we sort of, you know, robbing Peter to pay Paul? I had someone say that to me word for word, literally yesterday, that I was talking to for the first time. And I was able to say to them, no, we have the data, we have the research, again, not just from our work, but from, you know, a wide swath of the sector that says actually most capital campaigns not only do not cannibalize the annual fund, but very often the annual fund grows in the ensuing years after the campaign. And I'll show you the underlying data of that later on. And then, you know, mentioned this before, but most people kept their foot on the gas when the pandemic was really raging, you know, still in 22, you know, 23, a lot of concerns about the recession and inflation, the economy. Most people kept their campaigns going. They didn't pause, they didn't stop, they didn't postpone a campaign. That's not to say those things weren't headwinds, and there are going to be headwinds again, most likely. I can't believe I'm saying that. It's kind of annoying, but you know, if you got a clear case for support and you've got an underlying base of supporters, you can still do it. But navigating those headwinds is definitely something you want to kind of keep an eye on. So that's sort of the top level findings, but let me get into some of the details here. And please do ask questions. I got my chat box up here, open here. We'll save some time for answers or for Q&A at the end. But if I see something, I don't mind answering it on the spot here. So just some kind of interesting kind of anatomy of a typical campaign. One question we ask people is, what prompted your campaign, right? What was kind of the catalyst for it? Most people said strategic planning. About 3/4 of people said, hey, we underwent some sort of strategic planning. We came out of that kind of concluding that, hey, it's time for a capital campaign, or we at least want to investigate one. People gave other answers, right? And there's no wrong answers here necessarily. This is just kind of what people said. A little under 10%. They had perhaps a new leader come on and maybe want to put their stamps on thing or want to do something special. You know, a challenge gift occasionally can kick things off. That's kind of interesting. Organizational anniversaries, you know, as sort of the catalyzing event is a little rare, although very often a major anniversary, 50 years, 75 years, any number really is kind of woven into either, you know, the public phase or some phase of the project. That's not uncommon at all, even though that only says 3%. But again, strategic planning. So if any of you are maybe, you know, have that on the horizon, you might keep in the back of your mind that may be an outcome of those discussions or that process. And then we also ask people, hey, what are you raising money for? Probably won't surprise you that a majority of people said that it was some sort of new construction, renovation, you know, land purchase, expansion of facilities. But again, there were a lot of other answers and no wrong answers here. You know, new programs, program expansion, perhaps establishing or growing an endowment, you know, very common. But a lot of people said, hey, it's kind of all inclusive, not a comprehensive campaign, that's different, but sort of all inclusive, you know, multiple projects. We've got a building, we're going to boost the endowment, we're going to have a new program. But again, no wrong answers. This is just kind of how it shook out. So wherever you see yourself on the pie is okay. Pure endowment campaigns can be a little difficult, right? Because you sort of have to massage the messaging there, since there isn't always something tangible to show to donors, but can definitely be done and does happen on an annual basis for sure. But mostly buildings probably won't surprise you. Okay, so let's talk about success rates. And probably a better way, I always mean to change these slides. I think satisfaction rate is really a better way to describe that. Because that's what we ask people, did you consider your campaign a success? And like I said before, 96% of people said yes to that. Even that person who said that they only raised 75% of their goal, they even said, yes, we still considered it a success because, 75% of $5 million or whatever it is still a good chunk of change and can make a really big difference in that mission. Um, that was the lowest reported. So, some people have said to me, well, people who were unsatisfied didn't take the survey, not really seeing any evidence of that. I don't know why people, would have opted in to share their voice. But most people who kind of underwent the whole program seemed to be really happy. One organization even raised 156% of their goal, which I perhaps have some questions around that goal itself. Maybe the goal was a little too low. But either way, they were happy and they did a good job. Just some other sort of average stats, which aren't super actionable, but maybe a little interesting. The average raised was around 7.7 million. And for organizations below a million, sort of that small shop definition, their average raise was about 3.3, so about 3x the annual fund, which is great. That can be very transformative for organizations of that size, but more to come on the small shop specifically. But again, just some sort of benchmark stats for you there. Let's talk about the annual fund. This is my favorite. This is probably the most important. So again, this is probably the number one, I would say myth, because we sort of busting this myth here. We asked people a couple questions about their annual fund. So for people in a campaign and for people who recently finished a campaign, we asked them what happened to the annual fund during the campaign. Only 22% of people said that it decreased, which means almost 80% of people either saw an increase or it at least stayed the same. About a little over a third said it stayed the same. Which this is a good confidence builder in my mind, because I don't know if it's your experience, but when I talk to people, this is usually a top three, probably a top two concern. What is going to happen to the annual fund? So my headline here is, it is by no means a foregone conclusion that your annual fund has to suffer or go down or be cannibalized during a campaign. It can happen, as you can see, obviously, there are about 22% of people that it did happen, but it doesn't have to happen. And there are lots of things that you can do to protect the annual fund. And I assume that around 80% of people, employed some of those strategies. That is a topic of an entire webinar. I could talk about hours for this, but I think in a nutshell, it really comes down to communication, stewardship, recognizing people for their annual fund gift. Our co-founder likes to recommend the double ask, double thank strategy. Thank them for the annual gift, ask them for the annual gift, but also thank them and ask them for the campaign gift. Separate them. Hey, thanks so much for being an annual fund donor. You keep our lights on. By the way, we have this awesome opportunity. We have this great need to expand, or we have an opportunity to, do some new programming. Would you also like to be a part of that? Now, that is a super simplistic, version of something that requires great care to do, but it can be done. And I think the people that saw that 22% of people who saw that decrease, it probably took a one size fits all approach to communications, right? And didn't kind of meet people where they are, because you can imagine getting a capital campaign solicitation right after giving your annual gift and thinking, oh, well, I just gave, I don't need to give to this, right? That's a lot of what happens. But definitely a topic we cover on our blog, and I'll share some resources there, better than kind of my 30 seconds of advice. But the headline is, doesn't have to happen. It can happen, but it also doesn't have to happen after the campaign. So we asked just the post-campaign cohort, hey, what happened to the annual fund? in the ensuing years after the campaign. So the previous slide was during the campaign. This is looking after the campaign is concluded. And about 74% of people said that it increased or it was included. So a lot of these campaigns were comprehensive campaigns. Comprehensive campaign is when the annual gift is included in the capital campaign gift as well. But again, only 13% saw a decrease. So capital campaigns can sometimes be kind of a catalyst or a supercharger for the annual fund. So, if this is a concern of yours, here's some data. Again, it can happen, but it doesn't have to happen. And I think any, capital campaign consultant or, seasoned professional worth their salt is going to keep this front of mind, through all stages of the campaign. Because, no one wants to see that annual fund suffer just to raise, a bit of a one-time, windfall from a campaign. So I would say kind of myth busted there. But again, this is something we're going to ask about every year. We'll keep an eye on it. But in the two reports hasn't really changed by only single digit percentages. Okay, so let's talk about the feasibility study. So there were several questions around the feasibility study. A feasibility study is a pretty common component of most capital campaigns. Not every capital campaign does a feasibility study, but we recommend it in most cases. If this is a new concept to you, if you've never done a campaign, this is kind of an early stage phase of a campaign where you are testing the case for support and your goal with kind of a select group of supporters, usually 20, 30, 40 close supporters, major gift donors, prospective major gift donors, other kind of major stakeholders. The old adage of kind of ask for advice, get money, ask for money, get advice. This is the former. You're sort of asking for advice, you're testing the plan, and that's a really good lead into the solicitation that is sort of subsequent to that. So again, happens early on. And we ask people a lot of questions about their study, but one thing we were sort of curious about is how did you conduct it? So when we're talking about, interviewing 20 to 40 stakeholders, the question we wanted to know is who's doing the interviewing? Now, sort of the common, more formal practice of this is that there would be a third-party consultant brought in to interview your stakeholders, kind of anonymously, confidentially, and then sort of report back to you again anonymously what those people said. This is changing. So this is something we've been asking about. And I would say if I had been conducting this study, 20 years ago, right when I was out of college, I don't think that number would be lower than 80%, but it's around a third of people doing it that way. A lot of people are kind of seeing the value of, hey, maybe we should conduct those interviews. We hold the relationships. We want to know who says what. No hard evidence that people are less than forthcoming with a staff member versus a consultant. And some people take kind of a middle road approach where maybe it's them and a consultant in the room, but it's a pretty even 1/3 split here. And if I were to get my crystal ball out, I would think that kind of just a consultant number is going to continue to drop every single year, maybe slowly, but I think it will drop every year that I look at this. So as you are kind of considering your feasibility study, if that's maybe on the table for you, there's more than one way to do it. There are pros and cons, and you got to choose what's best for your organization. But you don't have to just kind of go the formal route of we're just going to hire somebody to talk to our people for us, because a lot of people don't do it that way. Kind of interesting. Regardless of how you conduct the study, there were some really interesting sort of byproducts or effects of doing the study. So one question I asked, which I'll show later on in detail here, is I asked people, hey, what were some of the benefits of conducting a campaign beyond just the dollars raised? I gave people a long menu of options, things like, our staff got better at asking for bigger gifts. We increased major donor relationships. There's a whole laundry list of things, and people could choose, what resonated with them. And I'll show you the full data of that. But I looked at those answers and cross-referenced them amongst people who did do a study versus those who didn't. So one question I asked was, did you do a feasibility study? Yes, no. And I kind of compared their results based on that in a lot of different categories, but especially this category. So when it comes to deciding whether or not you should do a study, this may be compelling to you. People who did do a feasibility study, which is technically optional, they were twice as likely to report that a major benefit of the campaign included increased staff effectiveness, better fundraising internal systems, and crucially, and I'm going to talk about this at length, strengthening major donor relationships. And when I see this data, it kind of makes sense to me because when you're doing a feasibility study, you are talking to major donors. Your staff is probably involved in that, at least, 2/3 of the cases, as you saw in the last slide. And if you've never done this before, if it's your first campaign, or if maybe your major gift program is a little nascent, that can be a way to kind of level up your staff members or maybe your board members and volunteers. So there are a lot of benefits to doing the study. You get a better idea of how much money you can raise. You're sort of doing some stewardship with those major donors. So if maybe you're on the fence with should we do a study, or maybe someone in your organization isn't sure if it's worth time and investment, because it is a time and investment for sure. But there are a lot of benefits besides do we know what our goal should be? And I asked people, amongst those who did a study, what happened to your goal? A little under half said that it didn't change. So they tested 5 million. They came out of it saying, yeah, 5 million is our number, which is good. About a third of them, the goal went up. They tested 5 and they came out and said, actually, we can raise 7. Wouldn't that be awesome? We can do some great things with that. And then about 20%, it went down. Tested 5, came back at 3 or 4. All of those are good outcomes because you've got a better picture of what your goal should be. So again, that's a real tangible kind of good reason to do a study. Because if you go in like, well, we think we can raise 5, we're going to do 5, and then you get kind of far along, maybe you get a year or more in, it's like, oh gosh, actually we can only raise 3, but we've maybe broken ground on this $5 million facility. And I know I'm kind of generalizing there, but that can be very stressful, right, to say the least. So a couple data points there, maybe why we should consider doing a study, and take it with a grain of salt. Like, I sell feasibility studies, my agency provides those, but what I'm trying to do is provide some data besides just an agency guy saying you should do one because people do one. Here are some kind of concrete reasons that people are telling us that were kind of a result of doing the study, right? um, Okay, let's talk about headwinds. So this is data from our first benchmark report, not the most recent one. When we first did the survey, kind of late 22, early 23, pandemic was still top of mind, of course. But only about 26, 27% of campaigns were paused due to the pandemic. So most people kept their foot on the gas. Now, I show this because I'm not trying to minimize the difficulties that these things presented, and we're going into, it seems like, another kind of rocky phase with the economy, with probably inflation again. Speaking of inflation, we asked this in 23, 24. Again, only about 13% of people paused or postponed the campaign. So what I like to say is, don't be Pollyannish. I'm not. These are headwinds. They are definitely things that are difficult, but don't let it totally pause the campaign. This kind of idea like, hey, should we even do a campaign now? It just seems too hard out there on people. If you've got a clear case for support, a clear need, you've got an underlying, supportive donors already, don't decide for the donor. That's kind of my mantra, that, you can ask and they can say no, but if you don't ask, they're definitely not going to say yes, right? So I would say keep your foot on the gas. These people who paused, I wonder if maybe now they're regretting it, right? They're coming out of it in 2024, 25 into not a much of a better climate, and still they haven't achieved that project that they wanted to see come to fruition, which kind of breaks my heart, right? But again, not to be Pollyannish about it, these things were headwinds. So what I did in the most recent study, and I might actually have to go back to a more targeted question, unfortunately, is, did you feel that external factors negatively impacted your campaign? Not necessarily derailed it or paused it or postponed it, but did they have an effect? And 44% of people said yes. They did, and those were challenges that had to be overcome. But a majority of people said, as tough as things were, we recognize that 80% of the goal is probably going to come from 20% of the people. The wealthy, for better or for worse, tend to kind of do well in these times, unfortunately. So when it comes to, postponing a campaign, the data seems to suggest that if you do, you're probably going to be in the minority. Now, there are good reasons not to do a campaign. No underlying major gift support, an unclear case for support. But if you've got those things and you've got a great need, I say go for it. But we're going to have to deal with, again, and the next study will bear this out, inflation, most likely, economic uncertainty. So we'll see, but this is at least what the most recent data says about headwinds. So all of you, I know I say this to encourage you, don't decide for the donor. I think all of you are awesome and you've got probably great projects and great needs. Um, Go for it. You may get no's, but if you don't ask, you're not going to get anything. Okay, so let's talk about more of those benefits. So I alluded to this earlier. This was sort of my laundry list of benefits. So I asked people, hey, what are some of the other sort of things that you see happening in the organization as you are doing the campaign or as you finish up besides dollars raised? And again, gave people a huge list. People could choose multiple options. That's why these don't add up to 100%. So it was kind of a select multiple. But I kind of stacked ranked them here, the most common responses. So number one, 73% of the campaigners said that strengthening major donor relationships was a major benefit of doing the campaign. This is great. This makes me happy. It makes sense because, again, you think about the 80-20 rule, and not everybody falls into that. Some campaigns are a little more kind of broad-based support, but a lot of this is going to come from a small group of major donors typically. And if you do a good job, if you have a successful campaign, those relationships, they got to strengthen, right? If they don't strengthen, they're probably not going to give. So this has long tail benefits far after the campaign. You think about the next campaign, ongoing major gift support, legacy giving. A lot of times capital campaigns kind of jumpstart a legacy giving program because maybe new relationships are established or existing ones are strengthened. So very much a long tail benefit here to doing a campaign besides just kind of that immediate, although perhaps not so immediate, can take a few years, that sum of money you get in the campaign. A little over half said that they thought that they got better at soliciting large gifts. So maybe that was not a muscle that they were flexing very often, but a campaign kind of, generates that or requires it in most cases. And they came out saying, hey, we got better at that. That was something that maybe we weren't as good at, or, we improved. Again, long tail benefits there. The next campaign, major gifts going forward, all those things. A little under half said that they developed better internal systems. So this manifested in a number of ways. We established campaign policies, gift acceptance policies for the first time in our organization's history. We invested in wealth screening for the first time. We didn't have that, but we got it for the campaign, and now we have it ongoing. So there are a lot of ways. There was kind of a lot of commentary there. I love this one. About 41% said that they thought the board became more engaged. We're going to talk about the board here coming up as kind of a preview. But again, campaigns are very natural, kind of organic ways to get things from board, volunteers, investments in systems that is a good catalyst versus just kind of the day-to-day, like, hey, we should get this thing, but there's not an urgent pressing need, right? Even though those things would be very beneficial, a campaign can kind of help push those things over the finish line, right? And then a little over a third of people said that, the staff just overall kind of leveled up their skills. And I think this is compelling because, turnover tends to be very high in our sector. And maybe if we are investing in professional development, I do think going through a campaign is a form of professional development, because depending on your career, if you're changing jobs every few years, you may never be somewhere that does a campaign, but to land somewhere and kind of get lucky, even though it's a lot of work, maybe lucky isn't the right word, but good timing and kind of going through this process and learning a lot. I would hope that that would be repaid and perhaps, staying at an organization that invested in your professional development. And very often going through a campaign and includes investing in training, not just hiring a consultant, which is very common, but getting training for staff members and volunteers. So lots of benefits to doing a campaign just beyond just the dollars raised, which of course is the main thing that gets the most attention, and it should. But campaigns can kind of be a growth catalyst for an organization as well. Okay, small shops. So if any of you listening in are around that $1 million level, um, here's something you don't hear very often on webinars or blog posts or whatever. Small shops actually outperformed larger organizations in a number of categories. And I think there's a lot of things that maybe larger organizations can learn from smaller nonprofits in the context of capital campaigns. But before I get to that, number one thing is it was more likely that this was their first campaign. So I asked everybody, is this your first campaign? Is it your 10th? Most of the people who were under 1 million annually said, yeah, this is our first campaign. And that makes sense because, again, if campaigns are a growth catalyst, to not be at a higher annual fund level sort of suggests that they probably haven't done a campaign before. Their goals and goal attainment was smaller, but the success rates were not different at all. They came right around 96, 97%. So it's just kind of, the amount of zeros, right, in the number. But the third thing is what I was alluding to. Thinking back on the previous slide, small shops, they reported even higher levels of major donor relationship building and fundraising system improvement. So I'm gonna hypothesize, because I didn't really do an individual deep dive on this particular question of everyone who answered this way. But here's what I think happened. It's their first campaign. So of course, doing a campaign is going to require them to establish some things that have never been established. Gift acceptance policies, wealth screening, could be a number of things, trainings. So I'm not really surprised that because these were mostly their first campaigns, that these people said, yeah, we really leveled up sort of our systems. And then the higher levels of major donor relationship building, small shops are probably even more reliant on a small group of very dedicated supporters, but also more likely that there is sort of a nascent major gift program, right? Either very young or non-existent, and a capital campaign can kind of kickstart those, right, in the pre-planning phases. So I'm not surprised at all that they reported higher levels of relationship building. But here's something that's very instructive to, I think, or other larger organizations. These small shops tended to have more active executive directors and a more active board. And that again makes sense to me. Smaller organizations, maybe younger, perhaps more grassroots. The ED perhaps is a founder, or not that EDs are not involved in other organizations, but I assume they're very much in the weeds. And the same with the board. The board is there not just because they got sort of randomly recruited to a giant organization, but they're there. They really care about the mission. Perhaps they were a former service recipient. Um, so I'm not surprised that there was a high level of engagement, and it probably was required for them to be successful. Less staff, less volunteers, perhaps more onus on leadership and the board. But I think that's instructive to everybody, because as the bigger the campaigns got, there tended to be a less active board presence, and board engagement is really important and can help any campaign. So if you're sitting here, maybe you're a large organization, you got a big staff and you can afford a consultant or a whole team or whatever, I wouldn't let that preclude you from involving board members or other volunteers, because that can be very, very useful as well. And we're going to talk about the board specifically here coming up. But shout out to small shops. I love you. You can do it. And in a lot of ways, you're better positioned than some other organizations. Okay, so let's talk about the board specifically, because there's some interesting stats, but beyond just the engagement piece. Board giving during a campaign is kind of stuck at 63%, a little under 2/3. Board giving outside of campaigns This is something we looked at when I was at Bloomerang. A lot of people do research around this. It's usually around 2/3. So as a sector, we're kind of stuck at 2/3 giving in terms of the board. I think that for capital campaigns, it should be higher because it's kind of an organic, very natural reason to introduce board giving where maybe it is not in existence or maybe it's not, kind of written into your bylaws. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of like everybody has to have 100% board giving. I think there's a lot of really smart people kind of writing and talking about how that's maybe not a good goal to have. But I will say that if it is a goal of yours, a capital campaign can be, again, a nice kind of natural catalyst to get it. Like, hey, we're doing this campaign, like the gym needs a new roof. Board members, would you be willing to pitch in? Even, separate from, we don't have a board giving policy. You don't have to bring any of that stuff up like you would in the non-campaign year, right? So again, it's kind of an excuse, if that's the right way of saying it, to perhaps get to that 100% number if that is a goal of yours. And I'm not advocating that everybody have that as a goal, just to be clear. But the main thing I want to say about board giving is most campaigns do not derive a majority of their goal attainment from the board. So I would say after annual funds, this is probably the number two thing I hear from people who are, coming to us and saying, hey, we're thinking about a campaign. Can you help? So I would say at least once a month, I'll talk to somebody who says something along the lines of, we're a grassroots organization. We have a very highly engaged board. We have board members that are former service recipients or are of the same kind of demographic as our service recipients. They're not wealthy. Can we still do a campaign? And they've kind of already decided that maybe they can't, but they're waiting for me to say, yes, you can do a campaign. In fact, you're probably in a little bit better shape than perhaps organizations that just have a bunch of random wealthy people who don't, really have a strong tie to the cause. But now I'm able to say to them, the data shows that only about 15% of goal attainment comes from the board. So you do not need a wealthy board to have a successful capital campaign. That's my headline. If you do, fine, that can be very useful. But if you're sitting here like, hey, we don't have a bunch of doctors or lawyers or whatever, rich business owners, that's okay. Most people don't get a big chunk of the funding for their campaign from board members. Now, that is not to say that board members aren't doing other things. A very engaged, supportive board is very important, but they don't necessarily have to be writing 6, 7 figure checks to get the campaign off the ground. And in some ways, slicing the numbers, it was even smaller. It was closer to 10%. So again, I show this to give you some confidence and a benchmark to compare yourself. But if you're higher, that's fine. A lot of people are different, but most people came in around that 15% number. So in terms of engagement, like I mentioned, campaigns do tend to generate an increase in specifically in board chair involvement in fundraising. This is just kind of a narrow slice of kind of one board aspect, but I thought it was kind of interesting. In non-campaign periods, you compare those bottom two bullet points to the bottom two on the right, there does seem to be a little bit of an increase in that. So again, I know I've been saying this a lot, but campaigns catalyze lots of different aspects of the organization, specifically, and in this case, involvement amongst the board chair. So lots of benefits. But I would say that the board engagement thing is really critical. This is sort of a not necessarily something borne out in the data, but this is kind of my own experience that if the board doesn't believe in the project, support the project, if they're not willing to invest in training, in materials, consultant if that's required, it can be an uphill battle. But when the board is involved, maybe they were part of the strategic planning, they're brought on through, hey, this is what we want to do, this is what we think we can do. Maybe they participate in the feasibility study. That's kind of the makings for a successful campaign for the staff, for to have a feeling that, hey, the board's got our back and they believe in this. Again, like annual fund, this is a topic that we could spend all day on. we've got a free guide on this subject, just, what the board expectations should be. This is a good thing for board members to read. It's also a good thing for staff members to read about, what they should be expecting from their board. Check that out. Again, it's free. A salesperson won't call you or email you if you get that. But that's just an example of the kinds of things we have on our website that are kind of topical to these individual pieces. Okay, so it's about quarter till, so I want to leave some time for questions. So I'll start wrapping up here. I know a lot of questions are coming in here, which is great. Keep doing that. So number one is most people are satisfied with their campaign. Again, even if they're only raising, 80% of the funds, that still can be transformative for the organization. Usually the annual fund is not effective, at least negatively. It tends to stay the same or increase, both during and after the campaign. Not going to happen by accident, but does not have to happen, a decrease, I mean. So investigate that. That's a question you should be asking anyone that you're working with as you're maybe considering a campaign. What are the strategies for the annual fund? What are we going to do to protect it? Because you definitely want to be proactive there, but it's not a foregone conclusion that the fund is going to suffer by any means. I think doing a study is worth it, but I've kind of backed that up with some data. Again, a majority of people that didn't work with us, that did a study on their own or with someone else, it does seem to give you not only a better foothold on what your goal should be, which is going to save you, time and consternation later on, but also there are some sort of softer benefits: the major donor relationship, the staff effectiveness, staff training. It is a form of professional development. Those are all really good things as well. Big one, you don't need a big money board. You don't need a super wealthy board. Not saying that you should, change your board if that's the case. But you can still do it. That's kind of a tagline for a lot of these things, no matter where you are. Small shop, grassroots board, not sure about the economy, you can still do it. You can still be successful, but keep these things in mind for sure. And then, not just the board. One thing that's in the study that I'm not sharing here on the slides is that ED involvement also tends to increase during a campaign, and it kind of has to, right? You can't really put the ED in a corner for 3 years, right, when you're doing this massive campaign. So it's not an unobvious one, but is still a beneficial kind of outcome of doing a campaign. So like I said, there's a lot of good stuff in the report. It's just capitalcampaignpro.com/research. There's a lot of information in there that we didn't get into on staffing, use of consultants, mentioned the ED, pledges, the gift pyramid kind of shakeout, the length between campaigns. I think it was about 10 years. I won't be coy about that. Volunteer shares, there's a lot of good stuff in there that we just didn't have time to cover, as well as some more detailed information about the things that I did cover. I know I've kind of been blowing through this super fast because I want to be able to answer questions. But check that out, just capitalcampaignpro.com/research. If you're interested in campaign consulting, that's something that we can help out with. Check us out online. Again, we're pretty easy to find. But download the research. If you're a YMCA, maybe one or two of you are in here, maybe statistically are. Check that out as well. And let me know what you think. Send me a question. Send me a LinkedIn invite. If you just search for my name and Capital Campaigns on LinkedIn, you'll probably find me pretty quickly. Number one, I would say, any challenge accepted. If you want to see the data sliced in a certain way, let me know, because I love looking at this stuff. And if you're a specific org type and maybe you want to know how you fared compared to the others, I'd love to look at that. But critically, if you download the study and get on our list, you'll at least receive an invitation to take the next survey, which is probably going to be in the next couple of months. I mean, I would say June at the latest. I would love for you to lend your voice to this report. If you were sitting here saying, gosh, that was not our experience at all, I need to know that. I want this to be a even more reflective of the sector, or maybe saying, yeah, that's kind of what we saw, that would be edifying as well to lend your voice. So, be on the lookout for that if you're interested. It's not a super long survey, but if you're post-campaign, there's a lot of questions that the pre-campaign people obviously didn't get. So yeah, and if you're watching this as a recording, months on, all of those invitations are open to you, even if it's months later. So yeah, do some questions, Isabella. Is that cool with you? We got time?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, I'll just kind of scroll through here. Um, let's see here. Um, yeah, a lot of comments here. Um, let's see. So, oh, here's a good one from Terry, I think is your name. What would you say are the two or three key questions you should seek to answer when conducting a campaign feasibility study? Yeah, I think it varies for everyone. You know, usually those interviews and questions are tailored for the organization, the project, and the person that you're talking to. But in general, this is going to be a huge generalization because there's, 100 people or 50 people here. They're all very different. You know, you want to kind of explain, this is what we're thinking of doing. What do you think? Where do you kind of see yourself supporting this? Because what you're sort of trying to do is gauge where on that gift range chart they would be. You know, what neighborhood, what ballpark? Are they that lead gift at 1 million, or are they maybe some of the smaller supporting gifts at 250K or 500K? But I think the outcome, regardless of what the individual questions are, Terry, is that the person being interviewed feels like their voice was heard. They're sort of part of the project. They're sort of a stakeholder. You don't want to cede a lot of power, right? You don't want to create this sort of yucky, empower a power imbalance, which I know it kind of plagues our sector in a lot of ways. But making them feel like, hey, they're on the ground floor. They're in kind of the know in a small group of people that the rest of the population doesn't know about this. That's really kind of the beauty, and it's a nice kind of lead in to the solicitation, which usually comes kind of very soon after. Um, and there was a comment here from Salem that I really love, really love. Board members' social and political capital, willingness and coordination with the org's leadership is more valuable than a direct cash contribution. Yes, I'm assuming Salem, you put this comment in when I showed this slide. You nailed it. You said it way better than I did in the 2 minutes I spent on this slide. That's what it comes down to. The support, even introductions to people participating in the study, that's way more valuable than the funds. So I absolutely love that. That deserves more thumbs up than it has. What other, are there another questions here? Oh
Steve,
yeah,
I've
there's
got
another one. Board
I've got one
giving
if
can,
I may
oh yeah,
introduce
go
one
for it,
more
Russ. Yeah,
case.
go for it.
Yeah, just you touched on a couple of things. There's a interesting phenomenon of trying to raise your Canon sites higher than the amount you're actually trying to seek, and there's two real
Yeah,
reasons for that. One is a diversification risk. Sadly, celebrity endorsers or sponsors or donors sometimes commit crimes and do other bad things and result in a
right.
walkback of funds. I'm thinking of the Sackler funds that were used to support, art museums and the like. And
Mhm.
then there's also a pretty substantial time lag between a feasibility study and a construction start date. And over the
Yep,
last 48 months or so, the pandemic and all the supply chain disruptions made it a bit of a shooting gallery.
yep.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the guidance you're giving your clients now around, don't set your site at 100% of what you think you need today. Set it at X. What is X?
You nailed it, Russ. I was actually talking to an organization in Massachusetts yesterday who I don't think they'll mind, they're going to stay anonymous, obviously, but they at a bare minimum they need 1.5. But they sort of had a dream goal for the facility closer to 4 to 5 million. And they weren't super familiar with the process of a study. So in the course of the study, I was kind of explaining what they would be doing in a study and the value of it. But it's an opportunity, and I kind of encourage them, shoot for the moon, right? What is sort of your dream, your big, hairy, audacious goal? Like, what is your dream scenario for your facility, your programs? I don't think it comes from like, I don't think there's a hard and fast like multiple or number rule, but like, gosh, if you could make the biggest possible impact on the lives of kids or, eradicating this disease or whatever it is, start there, test it, and if you come down lower, that's okay. You still kind of know what is possible, what is feasible, right? So what I told them was have an ABC goal. A was that high 4 to 5 million number. C was the 1.5 that they sort of came to the conversation originally kind of thinking. And then B, maybe somewhere in between. So if they test the high number and it comes back, 2.5 or 3 is what's possible, then they know, okay, we can do the B version of the project. So what I say is internally, kind of have a few, maybe 2 or 3 options, test the highest, but not too high. Like, don't do something, wacky like 10 million when they kind of knew like 10 million is just not possible. But 4 or 5, maybe we've gotten 6-figure gifts before, so it's possible. But I don't think there's a real hard like formula or multiple. I think it just comes down to what can we do that would really just be fabulous for the community or for the cause, and aim high. And if it comes back, it's just not possible, probably going to be at least higher than that sort of original bare minimum goal, I would say. But everything you said is true. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I'm telling people, like, don't wait, because construction costs are probably only going to get higher. And everything you said is true about the lag, but the sooner you start, the sooner you can kind of realize probably the lowest possible prices. But also bake that into the goal, right? Assume, hey, these construction costs are probably going to inflate as time goes on. That's something you might want to have a very candid conversation with maybe your architect or your planner, or maybe even the builder, that should we tag on a little bit more extra just in case to give us some padding. So hopefully that's helpful. Nice. What else? I love people. Yeah, you should chime in. Just unmute yourself if you have something else to say. Oh, Russ, I think you made a comment also about the small shops benefit from a math distortion caused by, yeah, grant limit. Yeah, that's interesting. I think I might add that as a future question, because I'm sure that is true. I just don't have the data to back it up, but I think your instincts are probably right on there.
You see it from time to time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Well, this has been fun. Yeah, I mean, email me, send me a LinkedIn request. It's just capitalcampaignpro.com/research. You'll get that study. And yeah, I know I'm making a big ask here, but I would love for you to take the next survey in here a couple months. But you'll probably see it if you start following us. So thank you. I hope this was informative. I know you're all super busy. It's the middle of the workday, middle of the week, but hopefully you got something out of it. Oh, thanks, Isabella.
Yeah. A big thank you to you, Stephen, for sharing this incredibly informative and thoughtful presentation. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. As I said, we'll be sharing the recording and the slide deck in the next week or so. It will also be emailed to you. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, or to Stephen, and keep your eyes out for upcoming webinars. We have other awesome free webinars planned for you guys, so make sure you check those out. Have a great afternoon.
See ya.
Thank you.